Hi, I'm Michael Stittle,
And I'm Nik Nanos.
and welcome to Trend Line. Nik, first of all, you've got a different background there. Where are you?
Somewhere in Canada. I guess no, I'm traveling today and I'm en route to Victoria, British Columbia to CFB Esquimalt to attend a graduation ceremony for naval warfare officers, of which one of my sons is going to be graduating.
Amazing. Well, congratulations to him. That's fantastic.
Yeah, thanks.
So in today's episode, this is our second last episode of the season. Next episode in 2 weeks will be our year-end review. Nik, I'm hoping you're bringing back your fist pump rating scale. For those listening who can't see what Nik is doing, he is enacting that rating scale right now. In today's episode, the days are getting shorter, the nights are longer. There's a lot of anxiety-inducing headlines. So we'll be talking about how Canadians feel about their future standard of living. We're also doing a provincial check-in on Ontario, where the Ford government is talking about highways ahead of an election year. And our international look will be at travel, of course, as the Omicron variant is on everyone's minds. So first, Nik, how pessimistic are Canadians these days?
Well, technically, can I say ay, 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 ay?
Yes.
When you look at the numbers, you check out the trend line. We ask Canadians, and this is one of the questions that we track on a regular basis. Do they think that the next generation of Canadians will have a higher, lower, or the same standard of living? 63%, or about 6 out of every 10 Canadians, believe that we'll have a lower standard of living, while only about 11% think that we'll have a higher standard of living. That's a factor of 6 to 1. So that, Michael, think of it this way. You're walking down the street in your neighborhood, six of your neighbors basically have a cloud going over their head, following them around because they're thinking their kids or the next generation of Canadians will have a lower standard of living. And when you look at that trend line in the long term, that 63% is the highest that we've seen since we started tracking this about 10 years ago.
Wow. I mean, we've got talk of inflation these days, but how much of that pessimism is from the pandemic, do you think, Nik?
I think we should just call it a cocktail of pessimism because
Hmm.
choose your poison right now. So there's still people that are worried about the pandemic. And now with the Omicron variation, what that might mean. There are people that are worried about climate change. Think if you happen to be in British Columbia, you've dealt with floods, you did with fire. And now we have inflation where people are just worried about paying the bills for basic items. And you roll up all of those things, and a combination of all those factors, I think at least, is driving this whole pessimism about the future.
Hmm. Speaking of the environment, where does that rank in the list of concerns for Canadians right now?
Well, in the latest tracking that we do every week on the top unprompted national issue of concern that we just released, the environment is now is number one, and it's starting to pull ahead
Hmm.
of other issues. And the interesting thing is coronavirus is number three, at least in the latest Nanos tracking. It hasn't been this low as a top unprompted national issue of concern since the beginning of the pandemic. It's going to be interesting to see with this Omicron variation whether that fuels greater concern about the pandemic. But right now, the trajectory is in favor of the environment as a top issue of concern. And I think a lot of that has to do with the terrible stuff that the folks in British Columbia have been dealing
Hmm.
with.
Uh, Nik, what does this pessimism, how does it sort of affect federal politics if you're the ruling party? How do the Liberals, I guess, react to this?
Well, I think not just for the Liberals, but for all of the federal parties. Here's what people want to hear about. What are parties proposing, including the government, but what is everyone proposing to deal with the environment? What are governments and the federal party leaders proposing on inflation? It's one thing. It's fair for the opposition parties to attack and blame the federal government, but there's also a responsibility for that they have, in addition to the government, to actually propose what the path forward is. Is
Hmm.
inflation good or bad? Will we be accepting inflation for a long period of time? And this is where the Bank of Canada comes in and their long-term strategy. So I think what Canadians want to hear about is, will this be the new normal for the price of gas and other types of things that people need every day? Or is this a one-off? Will it go back to perhaps the way it was even just a month or two ago.
Nik, in the last episode, we discussed the throne speech and what to watch for and whether we would see any big ticket potential legacy items for Trudeau that might signal that the Prime Minister was thinking of stepping down. What did you think of that speech?
Well, I think that speech, there weren't a lot of big surprises, but it's pretty clear that the Liberals and the Prime Minister are focused on delivering on key elements of the platform that they've had since 2015, right?
Mm-hmm.
So childcare, the national childcare program, and also reconciliation with First Peoples, Indigenous peoples. So I think those are the big things, and perhaps for Justin Trudeau, those are pretty major accomplishments if he can, for example, get Ontario on board on the childcare program. After all, if Jason Kenney, the United Conservative Party person in Alberta, is good to joining up with the federal government on childcare, what about Doug Ford in Ontario, right? And Ontario's I think needs to be part of that to make it a real national program for the Liberals to claim victory. But I don't know whether Doug Ford wants to give the Liberal brand any kind of victory, because he's going to be looking at his own electoral fortune soon enough in the coming year. But I think what we saw in place in the speech from the throne, and also the latest cabinet shuffle, is a number of individuals, Nita Anand, for example, at Defense, being elevated. That could be a potential leadership aspirant. Chrystia Freeland is still there. Champagne is still a key factor. Jolie got a promotion. That's interesting what that might signal.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a number of people that have been put in positions that could challenge for the leadership. And we also have a speech from the throne that if the Liberals and the government can deliver on that, perhaps Justin Trudeau might be thinking about what he might want to do in the future if he believes that he's accomplished his mission and what he set out to do as Prime Minister.
So I'm glad you mentioned Ontario and Ford and childcare. I mean, watching that press conference in Alberta with Jason Kenney and Justin Trudeau was almost surreal, seeing those two together. We are heading into an election year in Ontario. How is the Ford government doing in Ontario these days?
How do we say okay? When we look at data from my friend Jean-Marc Leger, who heads up Leger Marketing, the latest numbers in the Ontario race has the Progressive Conservatives of Ontario at 34%, the Liberals at 31%, NDP at 26%. Interestingly, compared to the last election, the Conservatives are down about 6 points. The Liberals are up significantly, because they were, I think, at around 20. They were at around 20, so they're up. And the NDP are down a bit. So, what we're seeing is, factoring the margin of error or the accuracy for the research, probably a very tight race between the Progressive Conservatives in Ontario, the Ford Conservatives, and the Stephen Del Duca Liberals. And a bit of a disappointing number probably for the New Democrats, because last election they're at 34, now they're at 26, and they've got to be probably a little bit disappointed on that front.
So Stephen Del Duca is the new leader of the Liberal Party. How are his personal numbers? How likable is he compared to his party's brand?
Well, according to the Leger Marketing stuff, I think his favorability scores are at around 23%, which means there's no political coattails. Why don't we say that? For Stephen Del Duca, he's basically trailing his party by about 7 or 8 percentage points. This compares to both Ford and Horwath. Ford's favorabilities are higher than party standings at around 40, and Andrea Horwath's favorability ratings are higher than her party's, because she's at around 39% favorability compared to the party's ballot numbers, which are at 26. So no political coattails for Stephen Del Duca. I guess one way to look at it is that there's room for improvement.
Yeah.
The other way to look at it is he's not a boost to the Liberal political fortunes at this particular point in time.
Well, we've sort of seen one attempt, I guess, at a Hail Mary pass from him, and that was promising electoral reform. Seems like a very bold move. We saw that before from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, I believe.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Justin Trudeau, pre-2015, campaigned on electoral reform, because obviously our electoral system in democracy was broken. And then a funny thing happened. he won under the old system, and then all of a sudden electoral reform hasn't been as much. I won't say it's not a priority, has not been as much of a priority compared to other things. Now, in fairness, the guys had to deal with the pandemic, right? So he had to deal with Donald Trump and a pandemic, two calamities, why don't we say, that any government, whether conservative or liberal or whatever party it is, would be difficult to deal with. It's understandable how electoral reform has taken a bit of a back seat in the agenda of the government. However, what we've seen is a pattern of behavior, and this isn't liberal, this is just in general. Parties that are not winners talk about electoral reform, and then if they happen to win under the system, all of a sudden, maybe it's not too bad. Let's keep the system the way it is, because it has kept them in power. The fact of the matter is, if the Liberals had embarked on electoral reform in 2015, they could have lost the 2019 and the 2021 election, because we do know that they received less votes than the Conservatives. And any sort of electoral reform, whoever wins the greatest number of votes, that would have been a political advantage for that party, and it wouldn't have helped the Liberals in 2019 and 2021.
Wow. Nik, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we will be talking about the border.
Sounds good.
And we're back. Nik, a lot of anxiety-inducing headlines about the Omicron variant in the past week or two. We have been toughening up our international travel restrictions, trying to keep this variant from spreading. What about our border with the U.S.? How do Canadians feel about that these days?
Well, Canadians have a fixation, a compulsion, an utter focus on the border. It's because 90% of the population lives within a 1-hour drive of the U.S. border. And what's interesting is just this week, the government introduced more stringent rules for travel, not just across the border, but within Canada, for I'll call it an absolute proof of vaccination to travel. But the thing is what's interesting is that Canadians are cross-pressured on this. In polling that we've done, and we do a lot of polling on border issues and perceptions of health threats and security threats and stuff like that. In research that we did earlier this year, when we asked Canadians, and then we also asked Americans, we did a survey of Americans and Canadians and asked them where the greatest health threat was. Interestingly, if you ask Canadians, the top health threat was in Canada and in the United States perceived of as being China. But when we ask about each other, we get some really interesting results. 30% of Canadians believe that the greatest health threat to Canada is actually the United States. The kicker is, ask an American, and only 5% of Americans think that Canada is the greatest health threat to America. So That's only 1 out of every 20, which means there's a bit of an asymmetrical view here, where when Canadians think of the US, there's a significant proportion see the US as a threat to the health and as a health threat, but that Canada is not really on the radar in America as a health threat. Probably explains why the Americans want to open things up. If they were looking at polling like this, they'd say, hey, no one thinks that Canada is a problem from a health perspective. Let's open up that border and get people moving across it. But for Canadians, there's still 3 out of every 10 that think that the US represents a health threat to Canada.
That's fascinating. Nik, do you think, are we looking at, pressure from the Americans to keep the border open this time around as the Omicron variant spreads?
Well, I think the Americans want to keep the border open. And I think, we need to keep the border open. First of all, we need to say that because it's very important for the economy to keep the border functioning well. But I think what this puts into spotlight is that as we keep the border functioning to keep the economy going, it's going to be probably more important for the Canadian government to explain how this open border will work and what will be in place in order to protect Canadians. So this is not about closing the border. This is just about a greater burden on the Canadian government, at least, to explain how the border will work and how the Canadian government will minimize health threats from outside in terms of the movement of people.
Nik, as always, thanks very much. And where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Nik, Nanos, or visit the website for tons of data at www.nanos.co.
And for more about the news that Nik and I have discussed in this episode, of course, you can also go to ctvnews.ca. Thanks for listening.